What's going on, everybody out there in internet world? This is Reeves Srinivasan broadcasting you live. I'm going to be your moderator today. Welcome to the 99 Pages Book Club, broadcasting live from South Lake Tahoe, California, the reading capital of the world. We are on a mission to make reading fun and achievable for all. Each week, we read no more than 99 pages of a book, and we'll live stream a discussion with awesome panelists and Q&A right here. Even if you can't squeeze in the reading, that's okay. You got 99 problems, reading ain't one. If you enjoy the conversation, please hit subscribe below. Every vote of support counts. Please also follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn Live at 99 Pages Club. Today is our last session on Wes Moore's 5 days, covering the 5 days in Baltimore, Maryland, following the murder of Freddie Gray. In these last 99 pages, the author wraps up a lot of the narratives. We learn about Partey's career struggles after the incident. We hear how two very different businesses, Shake and Bake, owned by Anthony, Black-owned in a poor community, goes out of business, and then the Baltimore Orioles, they just played the game without fans, how they all dealt with the crisis and had different outcomes. And we get a really thoughtful endnote from the author on poverty, philanthropy, policing, healthcare, and the state of our country. A couple admin notes before we get started. The winner of our poll for our September book is Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. So go ahead and pick that up. We're going to start and read that first 99 pages for a live stream book club on August 30th. But next week, August 3rd, we're going to give the panel a break, and we are going to do an author interview with one of my close friends, Bharith Krishnan, the author of Confessions of a Campaign Manager, a really highly rated self-published memoir on political narratives. And it actually competes right up there with Madeleine Albright's political narrative. It's really impressive. So we're going to have a great discussion with an author, how he went through that process. And he's got a new book coming out as well. I think it's going to be a great conversation. Right now, I want to go right into introducing our panel. I'm really excited to just get this going here. Let's first introduce Stesha Doku. As we know, go to steshadoku.com, an amazing artist and, of course, an anesthesiologist out of North Carolina. And I think another really awesome thing is she and I are working together on seeing if we can actually take this book club concept and use it in healthcare design. So if you've got interest in that, go ahead and throw it in the chat. We'd love to hear what you think about that idea and get that on the radar. I'd also like to bring in my boy Bobby Merriweather, my West Point classmate, dear friend from the Bay Area, cybersecurity consultant working for Palo Alto Networks, just crushing it, has been an amazingly valuable addition to this panel. I want to bring in Cal Walters, another one of my West Point classmates, another combat veteran just like Bobby, currently the Chief of Justice for the 82nd Airborne, a legal mind that cannot be matched in my generation. So I'm so grateful for him. He's also the host of the Intentional Living and Leadership podcast. Check it out if you can. Amazing contributions there. And I am particularly blessed to be able to announce that Brian Kraussek is with us. Now, Brian is a former police officer. He's from New York, Panama, New York, began a police career, transitioned into fraud investigation, and then took his talents in that into the insurance industry and is now as a successful leader in that industry. But he is a very passionate contributor on all issues regarding race and police relations. He's written some wonderful articles that we'll be sure to set out in the chat. But honestly, I'm just so thrilled that we can all be here together. So, Brian, I would love to just start off with you, if that's all right here. You know, you have a really amazing background. Can you help us get in the mindset of a police officer? What are the attributes that really define this profession? Age, income, insecurities, perceptions of danger, etc. Can you get us in that headspace, please?
Sure. Thanks. And Rajiv, thanks so much for the invitation. It's really great to be here. You know, a lot of police officers, I think, begin the job and they share this sort of what I think of as a defender mentality, meaning they're very service-minded people. They join the police force because they want to defend the good from the bad. I mean, it really is that binary, right? They generally don't enter the career because they want to hurt anybody, of course, but they also accept, as military people do, that in defending the good, their duty may cause them to get hurt, or it may cause them to hurt somebody else. I would say that the overwhelming majority are either in their very early 20s and policing is really kind of their first real job, or they come from the military and they're looking to continue their service in other ways. I have found in most of the officers that I've interacted with that the vast majority come from kind of the lower end of the socioeconomic spectrum. It's really rare to find an officer who was born into a life of advantage, if you will, and they are willing to accept very low pay in exchange for their service. I myself, as an officer, made $26,500 a year, which, at that time made things like buying a home seem very much out of reach. Just as many of them come from backgrounds with little economic advantage, the majority have limited education and life experience too, frankly. Police work itself really only requires a high school diploma or a GED. So in most cases, that's the extent of the education that officers have. So I think as a result of their own socioeconomic standing, the level of education they have, and sometimes very limited life experience, a lot of officers have what I consider to be a pretty binary mindset, right? They view the world very much in terms of black and white. People either fit into a generally good category or a generally bad category. There's not a lot of crossover. There's not a lot of gray areas. As far as perceptions of danger associated with the job, I think that varies quite a bit across officers. But what I will say is always true is that when new officers hit the street, they have been taught to expect danger. And they've also been told that the worst mistake they could ever make is to do something that may cause a fellow officer to get hurt. I've often thought of the job in policing as, being characterized by long stretches of mundanity, sometimes even absurdity, frankly, but then punctuated by periods of really acute danger and high stress. And since you never really know when those moments are coming, you tend to become, as an officer, somewhat hyper-vigilant over time, and you start to view more and more people as a possible threat. So hopefully that's responsive, but that's kind of what I guess I think is pretty characteristic of the profession.
Sorry, I was on mute there. That's
okay.
My bad. Well, thank you for sharing that, sir. I really appreciate it. So if we look at, let's go into the mindset of a skeptic, right? And I hear this a lot from folks who just don't really understand what we're talking about here. Because what they're doing is they're looking at the Department of Justice Bureau of Statistics reports. And what we keep on hearing as a society is that the story of violent crime in the United States is a story of black on black crime. And we do know from these statistics, at least, that they make up a disproportionate share of both victims and assailants. So, the skeptic would say, hey, doesn't that justify a degree of increased apprehension in black communities? How would you respond to that?
Well, boy, first of all, that's a topic that we could probably talk about for hours, frankly, right? In simplest terms, though, I don't think statistics like that justify the level of apprehension, but I do think it probably contributes to it in some way. And so, what I think is statistics like that, and even things like, music that comes from the black community or has come from the black community in the past that quote unquote advocates violence against either police or somebody else. Those are the kinds of things that officers and people who defend officers regularly point to as an attempt to sort of rationalize why there is a fear of black people. My problem with that is fundamentally that the statistics in the music and all of those things don't really explain the origin of that fear. And to me, I think the origin of it is frankly just the unfamiliarity and the lack of exposure to the black community. As humans, we are naturally sort of disinclined to feel comfortable around people who are unlike us or dissimilar or come from different backgrounds. And so unless we expose ourselves, we're really not going to overcome that. So yes, statistics can paint a dire picture. And yes, back in my day, Ice Cube said that he would swarm on any MFer in a blue uniform, right? And if you allow those narrow examples to inform your view of blacks, then you're going to be afraid. If, on the other hand, you actively engage with black people in the same ways that you engage with white people, and you endeavor to develop your own independent understanding, you learn their experience, who they are as human beings, your fear will diminish. If you don't do those things, and frankly, in law enforcement, if those things aren't compelled in some way, then the system is really kind of doomed, because some cops are going to come in with those negative perceptions. And throughout their academy life and throughout their life in the job itself, unfortunately, some of those negative perceptions are going to be reinforced, because statistics like these, extreme examples of danger involving Black people, will be presented in the academy to those officers as examples of danger and further perpetuate that fear. The job itself then really only exposes officers to the worst possible examples that they could see. So it's the context in which officers are exposed is an inherently negative context. So statistics like these from the DOJ, I think they can contribute to the problem of fear, but I don't think they in any way explain it or justify it.
Thank you for that, Brian. That's extremely thoughtful. I just want to take, if you don't mind, a quick second, just because she wasn't on at first. I want to make sure we introduce Jackie Newman, who's also joining us from Baltimore, from the Bay Area, but a former Baltimore public school teacher. And I'm really excited that her sweet, sweet mother, Judy Bello, is on with us as well. Someone that I have a lot of love for. And so Judy has a wonderful question for you, Brian, if you don't mind me bringing this in. Police officers, like firefighters and teachers, need to be paid more for a lot of reasons, including so that they can live in the community that they serve. And I think that's a really interesting concept. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, I know, like, we even learn in Baltimore that most of these police officers policing in Baltimore weren't even living in the city, and they don't. Right. I'm just curious, like, what are some of the things that law enforcement agencies today do to gain familiarity with the communities that they're serving?
Well, that's, I'll sort of attack that in two parts. So the first piece of that being the compensation aspect of it. And as I mentioned earlier, the pay is indeed very low. My father was a teacher, and he served in that way and didn't enjoy high compensation as a result. So I think that's a really important thing. It actually, many officers, no matter what jurisdiction they work in, find themselves doing what we call an off-duty hustle, which is, in order to make ends meet and pay my bills and all those sorts of things, I've got to do my normal duty rotations, and then I've got to be in uniform at some other job, whether that's a security type job or whatever, but I'm doing something to the side. So, you get some folks that are very tired, frankly. They work in a lot of hours just to kind of get by. As for living in the city, I mean, clearly, I didn't think this when I first joined the police department. I didn't recognize it as a potential problem, to be perfectly honest with you. I came from a very small town in Western New York, wound up working in the city of Winston-Salem, lived on the outskirts of the city where it was fairly cheap for me to live. But it's really essential that people understand that in a lot of law enforcement agencies, the cops that are working on the street have not grown up there. In fact, out of 35 or 40 people that were in my academy class, there was one person who was born and raised in Winston-Salem. All the rest of us came from somewhere else. And that creates, and as I'll maybe have a chance to talk about later, that creates its own set of challenges, right? Because it's very hard to police a community that you don't know anything about. So to the extent that compensation can enable people to live in the communities they police, I think that's a benefit. But I think also police departments have got to do a much better job of recruiting and incentivizing people who live in those communities to become involved in law enforcement.
What a fantastic response. And I actually think Lisa Bossarge, who is a librarian in Baltimore, I see her, she actually comments that during the unrest, there were state officers brought in who were not only unfamiliar with the city and its landscape, cultural and physical, that certainly compounded some of these interactions issues. Super interesting. I'd really love to continue on here. Bobby, Cal, Stesha, Jackie, we've been reading this book, 5 Days by Wes Moore, about these events, and law enforcement's called into question a lot. I mean, I'd love to bring some of y'all in for your perspectives. Cal, maybe we start with you. Any questions or thoughts for Brian here as we kind of finish up this book?
Yeah, Brian, I'd love to hear. I think back to my time in the military and just that fear that maybe was always in my mind that I might not make it back from that patrol. And I just wonder if you could maybe tell us what it's like to be a police officer and have that fear. And I think a lot of times that contributes to these quick reactions or, actions taken that ultimately end in the loss of life. Can you talk us through how police officers deal with fear and perhaps how they can manage that in order to police in a more protective way?
Yeah, that's a really, really insightful question. And, I think it is a challenge for officers. Truthfully, I mean, the military does share some common characteristics with policing, although I will say that, I kind of mentioned this in the beginning of the discussion here. The majority of the calls that you're ever going to go on as a police officer are pretty innocuous things, right? They aren't inherently dangerous. And so there's not a lot to be afraid of, but you also are going to have those moments that are incredibly dramatic. And if you don't have effective means of dealing with that as an officer after the duty shift is over, you're going to struggle. That's going to build up. So, I think the ways that cops commonly deal with that are the same ways that most people deal with it. They hit the gym, they try to burn off the stress. They're not often engaging in counseling or things like that. And there's probably an argument to be made that they should. Now, certainly if they're involved in, a shooting or something like that, there's very often a departmental mandate that they get some type of counseling. But there's a lot of other rigors to the job. There are a lot of other stressful situations that don't involve or don't end in the loss of someone's life that I think are significant enough and stay with you enough that you probably should have access to those types of things. So in short, I guess my shortest way to say that, Cal, is that, cops try to manage the stresses of their daily lives just like anybody else does. I don't think that there are specific things that are really geared to help a police officer manage the extra stress that they experience that maybe folks in the civilian world don't. And it probably makes sense to have something like that.
One quick follow-up, Brian. How much info do you have when you're showing up to a call? I mean, do you have a sense of whether that person's armed? Or because I would imagine that also contributes to the heightened awareness that you show up to when you are responding to a call.
Sure. Yeah, it depends. I mean, it really depends on whoever's calling that crime or that activity in, right? When whoever calls dispatch and tells them what they tell them, it really depends on how much they know and how much they can share. So in some situations, the name of the person you're looking for, where they're located, whether or not they're likely to be armed. But in a lot of cases, you're being called to a disturbance in a house, and you don't have any idea who's involved in that. Whether there are any weapons present or anything like that. So, naturally, your first order of business is to settle everything down enough and secure any weapons that may be on anybody or, within reach of anybody and those kinds of things before you can even start to move on to identifying what the problem is and figuring out how best to bring resolution to it.
Thanks.
Excellent question, Cal. I'd love to give Bobby a chance to chime in if you got something.
Yeah, I'm actually just amazed at the answers and the question that's been going back and forth. I do want to come back to the community policing piece that we talked about earlier, and I'd love to hear your perspective on it, Brian. If you were back in uniform, how would you approach the process of actually living in the community that you're actually serving and protecting? And what are some of the challenges that you can think of that will come to mind that might affect your day-to-day operations?
Yeah, so I want to make sure that I understand. So if I were in uniform, how would I transition? Like, what would that process be? I think, I'm not sure I know a great answer to that question, to be honest with you, Bobby. I mean, I think it's just a matter of making that choice, right? You've got to dedicate yourself to, for example, I lived on the west side of Winston-Salem, but I policed on the east side of Winston-Salem. And does that mean that I move myself and my family over to Winston-Salem? over to the east side. Certainly, I think that's helpful, right? I think that's going to increase my level of awareness of what it's like to be in that community. I think some of the objection that you would get, frankly, and the fear that you might get from officers if you ask them to do that, is, look, I'm out there and I'm working with, folks that, I'm arresting people, I'm taking them to jail. These are people who are legitimate criminals who are doing really bad things. And, I don't necessarily want to bump into those folks after I've arrested them in the grocery store, right? Which I think is a legitimate concern to have. So you do have to kind of overcome that aspect, of that question of how do you get the officers more embedded in the community. But again, that traces back almost to the earlier point I made, where it's not so much about bring me in from the outside to the city I've never lived in and then plant me in the place where I'm going to police. It's a lot more about more organically recruiting people who already live in those neighborhoods, who already know those neighborhoods, and have great historical context for what the experience with police has been in the past for people that live there, and encouraging and incentivizing them to be members of the law enforcement community. That, I think, is really the way that you can, over time, transition.
Yeah, thank you. I want to bring in some of these live chat questions. I actually ran past one that I think is actually really meaningful from Amitav Misra, who's in the Houston area. Police officers seem to have a lot of jobs, frontline social work and mental health intervention. And we actually kind of see this in Freddie Gray, right? Like, he legitimately has cognitive limitations. And we're asking, and basically what Amitav's point is that, do these really all belong under one roof? Like, in addition to getting familiar with the community, you got to now become somehow social worker, healthcare worker. You're responding to just things that are not necessarily in the, just day-to-day conception of what police officers do. So I'm just curious, like, how do you wrap your head around that as a police officer?
This is something that I've listened to this argument a number of times and seen it in the news, and I think that there is some truth to it. But I do think that people should understand. I don't know how to say this politely, but I think that notion that we wear that many hats and are asked to do, fulfill that many roles is a little bit overblown. And by that I mean, do we interact with the mentally ill? Do we interact with the homeless? Certainly. Are we dealing with child endangerment and domestic violence and violent crime and nonviolent crime? Certainly. There's a whole spectrum, and we're dealing with all those things, but we're dealing with them in a very sort of a narrow scope and only for a short period of time. So it's not the case that I'm ever in a position as an officer that I'm truly providing any sort of therapeutic remedy to a situation where mental illness plays a role. What I am doing is trying to remove the element of danger that may exist, because if a police officer has been called to a scene where mental illness may be playing a role, typically that's because whoever is suffering from the mental illness is doing something that's either dangerous to themselves or they're dangerous to somebody else. So the police officers are called in there to help stop that, help get it under control. But then they're turning that mentally ill person over to the appropriate medical professionals. It's not like they're staying with them. So I think it's achievable to do these many things. I think that I'm not sure that there's really a way to avoid it, frankly. Can you really send a social worker into what could be a very dangerous situation at the outset, not trained, not prepared to manage any of those dangers? It's, in my view, at least, it's a little bit unrealistic. So officers are, asked to wear a great many hats. I think the scope of that is more narrow than is sometimes understood. And I think it's probably going to continue, and it's probably appropriate for it to continue.
Thank you. That is a really fantastic response. I appreciate it. Stesha, I would love to bring you in here. And you and I have been, as we've been interested in kind of like, the healthcare design world and kind of understanding like what, actually it works really well off of Brian, what he's describing here. Wes concludes this book on page 260, citing the Pew Charitable Trust report that lead-based paint hazards in low-income children cost between, whether it's in water or in the paint, a cumulative almost $6 billion a year. And, like Brian says, they're not, if they're not actually getting called out, like this problem is, to deal with these sorts of things as regularly as maybe we are perceiving they are. Like, I'm a little confused then. How are we dealing with it, or if we are at all? And how do you even begin to address this problem? Because it's very clear from this book, in my opinion, that the lead exposure led to a lot of Freddie Gray's interactions with law enforcement and his inability to get on his feet. So from your healthcare design perspective, how would you address this?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think that this book really does sort of highlight, or at least brings to the forefront, the fact that lead poisoning is still a problem that exists. Like, I was surprised to hear the stats that he has at the end about how many billions of dollars could be different if lead poisoning was addressed economically in our communities. But, on an individual level, clearly it affected Freddie Gray, it affected his family. And I think it's something that people thought was a thing of the past, like people weren't battling with lead poisoning. It's something that, like, in medical school, I remember hearing about and talking about, but never interacted with any patients that needed to have lead tested, even though it was something that we sort of look for or screen for kids when we do like our pediatrics rotations. But I think the thing that sort of ties it together is that it's not just the lead poisoning in and of itself that contributed to Freddie Gray's circumstances. But if you look at it holistically, it more has to do with the poverty situation he was in. The people who are affected most by lead poisoning are those people who can't necessarily get out of their immediate housing situation. So in Freddie Gray's situation, his family was not able to get out of this housing because there was a level of poverty there that was so intense that they weren't able to sort of rise above the possibility of getting a home somewhere else. And for a lot of people, that situation, poverty, has so many other consequences. It contributes obviously to the health. It contributes to being able to get additional jobs, not having to worry about working multiple jobs all at once. And all of those are going to contribute to your health, being able to exercise, being in an environment where you are going to feel healthy or be able to do things that will keep you healthy, the food that you're going to be able to get. All of those things are so important and all tied together that when I think about his lead poisoning, it represents a much larger problem that I think many people in Baltimore are facing. How do you track poverty and how do you treat it on a very, intense level, so that the effects that are from lead are also going to be, dealt with at the same time?
Thank you, Stesha. That's incredible. Bobby, I see you nodding your head, man. And I imagine that this rings true home to you. I can only imagine what's going on through your head and heart right now. I'd love to give you the floor and just elaborate a little bit on your personal experience, man.
Oh, well, I'm blessed that we haven't had any medical situations like that where I grew up. So I was just nodding in appreciation of Stesha's medical response to that question, pretty much. But overall, I do believe it really is a socio-economical problem that we have going on. And I think, once we start attacking that from both ends, from the policing end as well as from an economic support end and providing these resources to these underprivileged areas, I think that's when we'll start seeing these changes. So I'm really just enjoying the dialogue going on right now.
All right. I love it. Jackie, I'd love to bring you in here and getting a little bit about the book, because something actually, Wes is the CEO of the Robin Hood Foundation. Like, poverty is really his focus. And yep. There was a line here, and honestly, Judy, if you're listening, I want you chatting in a response here too, because your perspective matters as well. But what he says on 259 in his author's note is that, we must eliminate the talking points of, what happened so long ago. Why am I being punished for what my ancestors did, or even, I think more descriptively, what somebody else's ancestors did, right? We know now today that, slavery and, and also just like the trials and tribulations of the civil rights movement, like the perpetrators weren't all white people, right? Like, and I think what's really interesting is that this cynicism of like, how do you, react to what's quote unquote punishment, right? Like, in the idea that we have to make space for folks that don't have all this privilege. We have to fix this problem, and it's not a zero-sum game per se, but that requires sacrifice from all elements of society, even those white people who don't feel like they participate in the problem. So I'm just curious from your perspective, Jackie, like, how does that react, not just as an educator in your head, but like, as a future mother, if your kids are denied certain privileges to accommodate diversity, to help alleviate this poverty, like, do you react or feel any of that as punishment per se?
Whoa, loaded question.
Uh-oh.
Most powerful parts of the book for me, being someone who's a fan and follower of Wes Moore and all the work he's doing at Robin Hood and fighting poverty, I just felt like his voice was missing. So that's just my literary review. Second of all, I think one of the most powerful lines in the book for me, I'm responding to yours, which was about racism. But for me, it was actually, I agree that poverty is a choice, but that choice is not made by the people who live under its oppressive effects. Rather, the choice is ours. And so you brought me to a section which was essentially, are white people being punished for something their ancestors did? And that's laughable to me, because this is not something that happened 100 years ago, 400 years ago. This is harm that is happening today. And I think it was MLK in Letter from a Birmingham Jail that wrote, one of the biggest stumbling blocks for Black progress is white moderates. It's not the KKK. It's people that say, I don't really want to send my kids to public school. I'm maybe not going to mentor the new Black person at my organization. I think there are everyday things today that will make change. I don't think this is something that is a problem of our ancestors, Rajiv.
Well, and I appreciate that for sure. But I mean, like, is it not, don't we owe a degree of empathy to even the poor white people that are out there that necessarily won't get the benefits of affirmative action, never really had a lot of, I'm just trying to articulate the voice of, someone who is probably going to pay for the sins of, generations past, other people past, and had no relation to their line. Like, is the messaging to that poor white community that, hey, sorry, we got to fix this problem over here, we'll take care of you later? I'm just curious, like, how do we show compassion to those who will ultimately not have opportunities because we're trying to, cut up the pie?
No, absolutely. Poverty affects people across race, across gender, across sexuality. I think one thing Wes talks about is that we have created hierarchies of power and hierarchies of people intentionally. And so I would just argue that that's something we need to think about and acknowledge, that we are also all complicit. I was a public school teacher, but for sure, I still thought a lot about my own wealth creation and preservation. Brian and I are both examples of people who went into him policing and me public education. He's no longer in the police force. I'm no longer in a traditional classroom, And so it is really hard to work in under-resourced communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. And actually, Chelsea, my lovely wife, actually pointed out a comment here that reminds us of a book called Hillbilly Elegy, is really where that question comes from. And, I appreciate Chelsea calling that out. It's just, this is just such a tough and difficult issue. And, it's, just as resources and wealth are all, we have limited resources and wealth, we also have limited degrees of empathy and limited degrees of compassion. And or at least it feels that way sometimes. And it's just, these are just very difficult and trying times. And I think there is something to be learned from, I think, the next book we are reading, which is Caste. I think we're going to get a little bit deeper into those hierarchies that Wes calls out. I hope that's fair. I would love to bring in another question from the panel here. Again, it's Amitav again. Why is the framing of helping poor Blacks at the expense of poor whites? There's obviously a structural problem in West Baltimore, and then we also hear, and I agree, Amitav. It's I'm simply trying to articulate the voice of someone who may be a skeptic. And then Julie Drury, as an educator, I see a lot of distrust for public education from families of parents who dropped out of school. How do we combat the distrust to try to help get out of poverty? That is a really interesting question. Who wants to take that one? I love that one. Jackie, I think I got to go back to you. You are the educator here. I'd love to see your thoughts on that.
Well, first of all, a little plug. There's a new New York Times podcast called Nice White Parents, and it is about the distrust of the public school system, such that white parents would advocate for public schools, but then not put their kids in them. And so I'm curious, actually, I'm going to throw this back at Brian. I am from a majority white county in Northern Virginia, and I taught in a majority Black city. And I had to do a lot of work to think about multicultural pedagogy. In fact, one of my books that helped me is for white folks who teach in the hood. So I'm curious for you, how do you think about building trust in the police force? What would you say, for white folks who police in under-resourced communities?
Yeah.
How do you build trust?
Yeah, so if you're talking about it from a, how does policy change as a result of some of what we're seeing or what needs to change? I'm really glad you asked that, because I welcome any opportunity to say that there is a really big gap in the curriculum of the police academy that I went to, and certainly police academies in other parts of the country. I mean, they're all very similarly structured. And that gap is that there is never any exposure to that community that you're going to police. So just like you came out of a very white hometown, as it were, so did I. And then I'm policing in a much more diverse community. And so how do you do that effectively? Well, again, it all goes back to exposure. If the police academy is really concerned about making sure there are adequately prepared officers who can interact across cultural differences and other differences, then they've got to, in my view, bring some of those community citizens into the police academy, bring them in as guest lecturers, have them talking about what's actually going on in the community, what their experiences with police have been, what are the things that they most care about, what are the things that they're most afraid of or concerned about, where do they think the police can help, when do they think the police are actually hurting things. That's to me, it just has never made sense why there's not some effort to do that, some introduction of those communities and the citizens that live in them in the police academy setting, to be sure that on day one, officers kind of know a little bit about the people in the community. For me, on day one, I had never stepped foot in the neighborhoods. I had never interacted with a single citizen of the community or of the area that I patrolled. Frankly, that shouldn't have worked. It's really kind of setting you up for failure, because you're then going to find yourself in very complex interpersonal interactions that are violent, that are dangerous, and you're going to be called upon to effectively mediate that and de-escalate it. So, again, it shouldn't work. And I really think police officers need to have that exposure when they're going through the academy. I lost.
Yeah, I'm really bad at that. Going on mute. Oh man, I'm never going to get used to a COVID lockdown. I don't care what anybody says. Folks, we just got some great dialogue coming in on the live chat. I just absolutely really treasure it. Please keep it coming. But I actually would love to ask Bobby a question, kind of getting back to the book. Because there's this incident in the book that to me really was very telling. And a moment of growth for one of our characters here, and it was Greg. So when we close out Greg's last chapter, he's a young kid, he's a basketball star, but loses his opportunities, just filled with rage, and it just coincides with this riot, and it's like this perfect storm of emotions. And he walks over, and he takes his knife, and he cuts into the hose during the riot, and he comes back at the end of the book, and he's like, you know what? I really regret that. I got nothing bad to say about the fire department. I respect the fire department. They're one of the only uniformed officers he actually respects. And he not only just has a sense of regret, but he also has this resolve to make it up. And to take it, to take that incident and become a better man from it. And so, Bobby, I wanted to bring that, incident to you and kind of see how maybe you could give us a little bit more color about like, what's going on in that, cocktail of emotions and feelings. And just curious if you ever yourself have ever had a similar outburst that kind of gave you the focus you needed to say, you know what, I'm not going to let the haters get me down.
Well, that's a really great question. Yeah, I empathize a lot with Greg because, for a lot of people that grow up in inner city communities, like I grew up in Philadelphia, when we define a path that helps us acquire more resources where we can have more provisions for our family and our community, if we wanted to start community projects, and that kind of goes down the tank, there is a lot of frustration because the area is not affluent with a lot of different resources. And I know a lot of this, we've been talking about that through these sessions, is it really comes down to the amount of opportunity and resources that are available for people in these areas. So, when there is one downturn, they can look quickly to find other avenues of approach towards success. And, I don't want it to come off like a crutch because I know there are a lot of people out there in the world that don't have a lot of resources that do amazingly well. However, in America, when you have areas that are affluent with a lot of these resources, it's a lot easier for somebody to mentally pivot to another avenue of approach to success than for people that have really put in a lot of time, money, energy, blood, sweat, and tears into their craft, whatever it may be, sports, art, music, or even business and entrepreneurship. When you put a lot of energy into that and it kind of takes a downturn and there's not a lot of available resources in front of you, you kind of get frustrated because the bills still need to get paid. You might have situations like lead paint where you have to take care of a sick family member and you don't have insurance to do that, so you have to pay for it out of pocket. There's a lot of stress that comes to that as well. So I can understand why he felt the way he did and how he acted. But also I think he was probably around a lot of good upbringing, maybe not even in his own household, but maybe in other areas of his community where it gave him that sense of right or wrong and resolve, as you put it, to say, okay, I need to make amends here and try to start on a better path. So I can empathize with that kind of ordeal, and I probably would have acted in a similar fashion. In terms of a specific scenario for me, one doesn't come top of mind right now, but I'm sure I deal with it every day. It's just I've been blessed with joining the Army and getting out of my immediate area and being exposed to a lot of different things, as well as my parents. Even though we lived in that area, they try to take us out and expose us to different things. So I had an expanded mind where I've been able to kind of be resilient in, when I have a downturn in my life, I could find another avenue of approach as well. But it does take a lot of personal energy to go out and do that. So when one comes to mind, I'll pop it into the chat.
I hope you do. And well, let me ask you this, man, just kind of follow up on that question. If you were advising Greg, like what kind of advice, and I guess, other kids like him, folks that are coming up, they're in high school and they see these riots, they see this anger, they're probably scared. Like, what advice do you give to kids like Greg that are coming out into the real world in the kind of, to try and make them a more stable and force for good as they come out?
Yeah, I would tell them, in life, you're going to take a lot of what we call L's. You're going to take a lot of losses, a lot of L's. But it's not, what type of L you took. It's not about what downturn you took. It's about how you recover from that. Because from that loss, from that L, you're going to learn a lot about yourself that will help prepare you for the next challenge and you might be able to overcome that next challenge based on what you learn about yourself from the previous failure. So I always try to inspire some of the people that I talk to on a regular basis and just say, life's all about, wins and losses, just like a sports game. And Greg's an athlete. When you took that loss at that one sports game, did you just quit on basketball? No, you didn't. You decided to continue on and fight for the next one, and you started to see some wins after that. So it's all about what you learn about yourself and how you could redirect that energy into your craft to pursue success despite what happened in the past, because you can't get back yesterday. You can only look forward to tomorrow.
Stesha, if you don't mind, I'd love to give you the same question. I'm sure you've had, I imagine through the book, you had a degree of empathy for Greg as well, and probably had some reactions to some of his judgments. What advice would you give to him and other kids like him across the country?
Yeah, I was nodding my head quite a bit while Bobby was talking, because I think he makes a lot of good points about, when you're reaching out to these kids, trying to keep them motivated. And I think part of that motivation is having them see, people like Bobby who have succeeded. And that's really important. I think that unfortunately in this country, we sort of suffer from what people would describe as an epidemic of invisibility. There's not a lot of Black people at the top in terms of the different fields. So, there's only so many Black doctors and only so many Black lawyers. And I think, some of that is proportional. We don't make up a majority of the country. But I think for people who are aspiring to get out of a bad situation or to want more for their children than, they had growing up, it's good to see people who have succeeded, so that message and that image in their head makes them want to pursue and to feel like there's mentorship. There's a lot of value in having mentors, even if you don't necessarily know them, even if they're distant mentors. I think there's a lot of value there in getting people to really be inspired to take that sort of next step in their life. So I think, for kids growing up now, it's hard. It's very difficult. But I think them seeing images will be really helpful to them in the future.
Well said. Thank you for that. Yeah, it's really hard. Like even, independent of race and income these days, like we're just going into such unstable times, with COVID, recession going on. It's like, it's just like compounding obstacles. And it's if I were young right now, I think the one thing that I would say about the generation coming in right now is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. And I'm really excited to see what this generation, after all they will have experienced trying to get back on their feet with education, with their careers. I just imagine it's going to make them stronger. Brian, I'd love to bring you back in here, man. We've had this really interesting book, and, as a law enforcement official, I know you must have seen a lot of really interesting folks who have made some interesting decisions in their life, et cetera. And I'll just be really interested if you wouldn't mind, just what advice you would give for young, maybe impoverished folks who might be engaging with the law. Like, how would you advise them as they go on their day-to-day lives?
Okay. I'm sorry, Rajiv, but I have to ask you to clarify a little bit your question. How would I advise them?
Yeah, sure.
With respect to how they, deal with the struggles that they have day to day, or how they're interacting with police when they're interacting with police, or?
Oh yeah, I apologize. I meant specifically interacting with law enforcement. My mistake for not clarifying. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, no, that's okay. I think, look, people have some fear on both sides, right? I would say it's perfectly reasonable to be cautious and fearful. Don't automatically assume the worst. Most officers are not going to approach you with any malintent at all. If you're afraid, if you're feeling afraid, say that, right? If the officer is making you uncomfortable, say that. Frankly, one of the things that police officers have to be really, really good at, and unfortunately not enough of them are, is evaluating human behavior in context. And what is often fear that's being displayed to them, they may misinterpret as suspicious, right? So, if there's a young man that's interacting with police and doesn't really necessarily understand why they're interacting with police, maybe it's because somebody called and said they look suspicious or whatever, be open, be honest with the officer. Tell them, hey, listen, this is making me really nervous. I don't know what I did. I am not a threat to you. I want to cooperate with you, right? That'll help officers that have a little bit more difficulty seeing the context of the situation, understand really what they're dealing with, and be much less likely to view it as a threat. And then secondly, of course, just as anybody should, comply with what they ask, right? As long as they're asking reasonable things, you should comply with that. Most of these interactions are going to be over in a couple of minutes' time, and everybody's going to walk away from them safely. So that's the best advice I could give any young person out there who's got concerns about, interacting with police.
Like as you're describing it, that's going on in my head is like when these young men are saying, I can't breathe. All these videos, it sounds like they're communicating with the officer. Right. So I guess, and honestly, it sounds like in a lot of these videos, they are, and of course, these are just anecdotes, right? I appreciate that, right? They're just videos. It's not like, it's still good advice. It's still very good advice. But I guess my next question is, what is your counsel to young and up and coming or aspiring law enforcement officers, like folks that are going out into a world where they got to police a country with 300 million weapons on the street. There's a lot of vitriol right now against the police. We're talking we got riots where they're calling to disband the police, etc. I mean, how do we counsel? Because not all police are bad, right? There are a lot of good people who want to serve their community, and we want to encourage that service. So, what would you say to those young officers?
So, yeah, very clearly. I mean, I wish I was in front of some of them, because I would say, first off, it's a tough job that you've accepted, and you're going to have to embrace the suck a little bit, right? I mean, the responsibility of wearing that badge and that uniform means that you are held to a higher standard than anybody else. So in a perfect world, that kid's going to tell you he's afraid. But if he doesn't, it's your responsibility to understand. It's your responsibility to ask the questions. It's your responsibility to approach every situation coming from a position of respect. And yes, there are dangers, but until you have concrete, real things that are happening that are posing a threat to you, you've got to maintain your composure. I mean, that's simply a part of the job. So my advice, to officers or future officers or aspiring officers is simply that they have got to recognize that the greater responsibility is theirs. They are the ones that are in control of the situation. They are the ones who are trained to react and to apply the appropriate techniques to a situation. And when they fail, it's nobody's fault but their own, right? To your other question about, and I don't mean to go off on a tangent here, Rajiv, and if I do, you tackle me.
It's all right, man. Go for it.
But I have to say, you hit an interesting point where you said, hey, we've heard kids and adults saying, I can't breathe, right? And the response has not been sufficient. And that, for me as a former officer watching that, I get so upset when I see things like that, because I know that these are not the things that people were trained to do. And there's an element of cruelty to that is not inherent to the job. It's not trained. It's at some existential level within that person that I frankly don't understand. One thing that I do think would be helpful to that, and at the risk of sounding obvious, I think a lot of people, when they think about the police recruiting process, they assume that those kind of really cruel, just terrible people are rooted out pretty quickly. And unfortunately, I don't think that's the case. To give you an example, the psychological evaluation that typically goes on for law enforcement during the recruiting process is mostly geared toward ruling out that I may actually have some form of diagnosable mental illness, right? That I'm not schizophrenic, that things like that. All that's great. But there's a real opportunity to go deeper and to use that psychological evaluation to understand that person's deeply held beliefs, what their worldview is, and whether or not they're truly well suited for the role of law enforcement. Most people that are out in civilian life, and work for big companies have done things like the Myers-Briggs and things like that, and these DISC evaluations and all these kinds of things that help you understand yourself in your natural state and help you understand yourself in stress. I never went through anything like that as a police officer. There was really no evaluation of that thing. So clearly those people who are not going to be responsive or listen when they're being told, I can't breathe or I'm afraid, those people have just never got to, we've got to avoid them ever getting a badge to begin with. And we've got to put better mechanisms in place at the front end of this and use some of the existing tools that are available to root those folks out.
Hey, Brian, I just have a follow-up question. What
Sure.
do you think what do you think it would look like for us to have accountability? Like, if someone gets through the process and they do some of the things that we're seeing out in the world today, like, what does it look like for people to have accountability?
Yeah, no, I mean, criminal procedure, absolutely. If an officer breaks the law, if they violate somebody's civil rights, there's no question at all that they should be charged with that. In addition, they should, of course, be decertified. A lot of people don't really understand what decertification is. So, for anybody watching that may not understand that, you can violate certain aspects of departmental policy. You can get fired from your job as a police officer, and you can turn right around and apply it in Greensboro, since you just got fired from Winston-Salem. And there isn't a cross-agency visibility to a lot of those things. There's not a lot of transparency to why an officer may have been terminated. Decertification prevents them. It's like you, Stesha, losing your medical license, right? Once you've lost your license, you can't practice anymore. And clearly, there are situations that rise to that. Anything criminal certainly rises to that. But anything that is even, is more of a civil violation of someone's rights, I think rises to that level as well. And this isn't a 3 strikes and you're out. Look, it's not hard to not violate somebody's civil rights. That's just a fact. It's just not. So any excuse that you may have after the fact, okay, I now, as a leader in law enforcement, consider you to be too great a risk to keep as a part of this department. And so you're going to be decertified and be out. So I think the accountability has to be there criminally very consistently when crimes are committed. And I think they have to take better steps even when crimes aren't committed, and it's more of a civil matter, to consider decertification for certain kinds of offenses.
Ryan, that is just, I'm not sure if you can really even appreciate, Brian, just like how healing that is to hear that response from your perspective. I think all of us are just so grateful that you have a chance to express that level of empathy. I think it's just so interesting because we don't get to talk to a lot of police officers when we're talking about these issues, right? And it's like you are like a living, breathing human being that has a heart and a soul, and you're also very educated. And we had a great conversation the other day about when you started the police department, you had a college degree, you were actually aspiring to go to the FBI, potentially. Like you were very thoughtful about so many decisions, and it's just so refreshing to kind of actually just have this conversation and dialogue with law enforcement. And I only say that because we are wrapping up. And what I want to do, just as we start closing this loop here, is I want to just go around the horn to each of our panelists who have led us on this journey. First and foremost, this was the first book that we did together. I don't know what the heck 99 pages is going to be, but I do know that this book and these 3 sessions will always hold a very special place in my heart because I got to experience them with you all. So just final words, reactions, advice for everyone. And I'll just go in order here. Stesha, if you don't mind, I'd love to start with you. And we'll go Bobby, Cal, Jackie, and Brian, you'll get the last word there. All right. Stesha?
Sure, yeah. Oh, I love doing this with you guys. So thanks for just the enlightening discussion. This was really great. I think that one of the biggest takeaways from our discussions is that there's so many perspectives, and the book really shows us that. And really thinking about the different perspectives and having empathy for whatever the other side may be, and understanding the entire story is so important for us getting to a better place together.
Thank you for that. Bobby, would love to, final reactions from the book, man.
Yeah, I second that, Stesha. I think this was an awesome opportunity to get not only understand the perspectives of the book, but also get in the perspective of like our panel here. We're like a very wide, diverse group. It almost looks like a Disney Channel situation right now. But it's awesome because we all come from different backgrounds, and we can add, our personal perspective on, a similar topic, but we all come down to the same, meat and potatoes, what we say in the Army. It's all about empathy. It's understanding each other. It's respect. And if we could have, more opportunities of resources in these underprivileged areas, then I think a lot of the social economic challenges that we've seen in books like this might dissipate. Might not go away altogether, but we could see a lot of a better outcome in the future. But I love this book. Great choice for Jeeve. Thanks for inviting us to the panel, and I love meeting every one of you guys and talking with all of you as well as our attendees. Thanks.
Yeah, right on, man. Cal, I'd love to go to you next, my man.
Yeah, Rajiv. Hey, man. Well, thank you so much for letting me be a part of this. The words that come to my mind are common humanity, the powers of story. And I think one of the cool things about this book is we see all of these different stories from all these different people And the big takeaway for me, I think, came from Bobby, where he just talked about how empathy itself is progress. And I think when you combine these stories and all these different perspectives and our ability to relate to one another and talk these things out, I think we made progress here as a small community by being able to empathize a little bit more with each other. So thanks, Rajiv, for the opportunity, and it's been really a joy to connect with you guys.
Thank you, Cal. Jackie, my dear, you are up. I would love to hear your final thoughts on this book.
Yeah, this book is about 8 stories, and it shows that it's not just about individual action, that collective action is needed. You have people making change from the ground up, but you also need people making change from the inside out and from the top down. And that's why I love the perspectives of a diverse panel like ours. Similar to what everyone says, you got to get diverse perspectives at the table together to make change.
Well said. Well said. And Brian, I just want to take a second and, Brian, over the chat, we've got a ton of people who are just so grateful for your participation today. And I hope this is a relationship that can continue. We're going to go on to Cast next for all those who are reading along with us. It was just a very brave thing for you to come on here and field a bunch of questions from a bunch of, random perspectives, random folks. And, I just was very impressed with you and really grateful for your service. And I'd love to give you the last word before we begin our sign off here.
Well, I have to say, I don't know how brave it is. I feel as much a responsibility as anything else. And I'm really glad to have the opportunity because, as I said, this topic is very important to me. It's very important that we see meaningful change through police reforms. And so having any ability to be a part of that conversation and if I positively influenced anyone today, I'm really grateful that I had the chance to do that. So would love to participate with you guys in future books and just really, really enjoy the time that I was able to spend with you all today. So again, just want to share my thanks and super glad I was able to contribute something.
Excellent, folks. Well, that's going to conclude our book, Westmore 5 Days. We are moving on in 2 weeks. August 30th is when we're going to start on Cast by Isabel Wilkerson. We're going to read the first 99 pages. And again, next week, while we're giving our panel a break, we're still going to be here. It's going to be robotic every Sunday, 4:30 p.m. Pacific. And next week, we're having a great author interview with Bharth Krishnan, the author of Confessions of a Campaign Manager. It is a wonderful and honest political memoir about his time on the campaign trail at a very young age and what he saw and learned about how the inner workings of our country work, really at the local level. We're talking county, state, city governments, where a lot of these policies that we're talking about actually happen when it comes to, making teacher, firefighter, police housing affordable in the communities that they are in. That happens at the local level, and understanding how that happens is very different from the federal level. So I wanted to bring him on because I thought it was a very valuable addition to this dialogue. We're going to go on to Cast after that on August 30th. And we are just so grateful for the panelists, for you, our readers. And we're on a mission to make reading fun and achievable for all. And we're just so grateful that you're on this journey with us. So be sure to follow us, whatever your poison is, whether it is Instagram, LinkedIn, Facebook. I am so cool now that I know how all of these things work. And this is literally the first time in my life that I've actually committed really to social media. And I work for a social media company. But really, guys, we're really excited for everybody's participation. And obviously, we're on YouTube as well at 99 pages. We want to make this easy and fun and achievable for you. So follow us where you are, where you want to be, and we'll come and make sure that we make this easy and fun for you. So with that, we're going to finish this